William Carroll sat in the shadows of his large office. The only light came from a row of glowing computer screens on the wall. The dim blue light made his neck tattoos look like dark snakes crawling up toward his jaw. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. His eyes were locked on one specific monitor. On the screen, the black and white footage showed his mother's bedroom. He saw the maid, Deborah, moving quietly near the nightstand. She reached out a shaking hand and picked up a small brown bottle of medicine. William gripped the arms of his leather chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He felt a hot surge of anger in his chest. He had paid a lot of money for that medicine. It was the only thing keeping his mother's heart beating. For weeks he had noticed the bottles were emptying too fast. He thought he was being robbed by a girl who looked too innocent to be a thief. "I've got you now," William whispered. His voice was a low growl. He felt like a hunter who had finally caught his prey. He reached for the phone on his desk, ready to call his security team to drag her out. He was a man who didn't give second chances. In his world, if you stole from the boss, you paid a heavy price. He was seconds away from ruining Deborah's life, never imagining that the camera was about to show him a truth he wasn't ready to face. But to understand how William ended up in that dark room with a heart full of hate, you have to go back to the day Deborah first walked through the iron gates of the Carroll estate. The estate looked like a castle made of cold gray stone. Deborah felt small as she stood in front of the massive front doors. She adjusted her simple black dress and pulled her dark hair back into a tight, neat ponytail. She needed this job. Her bank account was empty, and the city was a lonely place for a girl with no family. She had heard rumors about William Carroll. People said he was a dangerous man who ran the city with fear. But Deborah wasn't afraid of hard work, and she wasn't afraid of scary men. She just wanted a chance to survive. When the doors opened, she was led into a hallway that felt as cold as a refrigerator. Everything was made of marble and gold, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum. Then she saw him. William was standing at the top of the stairs. He was tall and broad, his expensive suit fitting him perfectly. His dark hair was slicked back and his eyes were like two pieces of flint. He didn't smile. He looked down at Deborah as if she were a bug he was thinking about stepping on. "You're the new girl," he said. His voice echoed against the high ceilings. "The rules are simple. You clean, you stay out of the way, and you never, ever go into my office. If you break a rule, you're gone. Do you understand?" Deborah nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Carroll, I understand." William didn't say another word. He just turned and walked away, leaving Deborah alone with a heavy feeling in her stomach. She was hired to be a maid, but she soon found out her main job was in the West Wing. That was where Yolanda Carroll lived. Yolanda's room was different from the rest of the house. It was filled with the smell of old roses and expensive medicine. When Deborah first walked in, she saw a very thin woman lying in a large bed. Yolanda looked like a ghost. Her skin was pale and covered in soft wrinkles, and her silver hair was spread out across the silk pillows. She looked so fragile that Deborah was afraid a strong wind might break her. At first, Yolanda didn't speak. She just watched Deborah with tired eyes. But as Deborah moved around the room, dusting the pictures and straightening the sheets, she started to hum a soft song she remembered from her childhood. "That's a pretty tune," Yolanda whispered. Her voice was weak, like the rustle of dry leaves. Deborah smiled. It was a warm, kind smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. My mother used to sing it to me." "You have a good heart, dear," Yolanda said, reaching out a shaky hand. Deborah took the older woman's hand. It felt as light as a bird's wing. In that moment, the bond was formed. Deborah didn't see a Mafia mother or a wealthy stranger. She saw a woman who was lonely and sick. She saw someone who needed more than just a clean room. She needed someone to care. Over the next few days, Deborah began to notice things that didn't seem right. The medical staff, led by a stern woman in a white nurse's uniform, were always whispering in the halls. They treated Yolanda like she was a chore instead of a person. They would burst into the room, shove a pill in her mouth, And leave without saying a word. Deborah watched Yolanda's face every time the nurse left. The old woman looked sadder and weaker every day. Her hands would shake, and she would cough for hours. Deborah knew what it looked like when someone was getting better. And this wasn't it. Something was wrong in the West Wing. The house was full of guards and cameras, but the biggest danger was sitting right beside Yolanda's bed in a white nurse's cap. Deborah didn't know yet that she was about to become a player in a dangerous game. She was just a maid with a low ponytail and a kind heart, but she was the only one who saw the truth. She looked at Yolanda, who was resting in her brown pajamas, and made a silent promise. She would protect this woman, said even if it meant facing the rage of the man with the neck tattoos. She didn't realize that by trying to be a savior, she was making herself look like a criminal in the eyes of the only man who could protect her. The morning sun tried to peek through the heavy velvet curtains in Yolanda's room, but the air still felt thick and heavy. Deborah moved quietly, her soft shoes making no sound on the expensive carpet. She looked over at the bed. Yolanda was wearing her silky brown pajamas, but they seemed to hang off her thin frame more than they did just a few days ago. The older woman's face was very pale, almost the color of the white sheets. Every few minutes, a small, shaky breath escaped her lips. Deborah felt a pang of worry in her chest. According to the medical charts, Yolanda was supposed to be getting the best care money could buy. William Carroll spent thousands of dollars every week on doctors and special pills from overseas. But as Deborah wiped down the mahogany dresser, she noticed that Yolanda's hands were shaking harder than usual. The silent symptom was right there in front of her. Yolanda wasn't getting better. She was fading away like a candle burning out. A sharp click at the door made Deborah jump. The head nurse, a woman with cold blue eyes and a face that never smiled, marched into the room. She didn't look at Deborah. She went straight to the medical tray and picked up a small plastic cup. Inside was a single white pill. "Time for your medicine, Yolanda," the nurse said. Her voice was like ice. She didn't wait for a response. She pulled Yolanda up roughly and shoved the pill into her mouth, forcing her to take a sip of water. Yolanda coughed, her eyes watering, but the nurse just turned away and started writing on her clipboard. "She seems very weak today, nurse," Deborah said softly, trying to be helpful. "Her heart seems to be racing." The nurse stopped writing and looked at Deborah with total disgust. "You are a maid, not a doctor. Your job is to clean the dust, not to give me advice. Stay in your lane, girl." Deborah lowered her head. "I'm sorry. I just want her to feel better." "She is fine," the nurse snapped. "The medicine is doing its job. Now take out the medical trash and get out of here. I have work to do." Deborah gathered the small bin of discarded items and walked out into the hallway. Her mind was spinning. She had seen people get sick before, but Yolanda's illness felt strange. It felt like a mystery that didn't have all the pieces. She walked toward the back stairs where the large trash bins were kept. As she reached down to empty the small medical bag, something caught her eye. An empty bottle of the expensive heart medicine was sitting right at the top of the pile. It was the brand William talked about, the one that cost a fortune. Deborah picked it up. She remembered her mother telling her that real medicine always had a bitter chemical smell. She opened the cap and took a sniff. It didn't smell like chemicals at all. It smelled like nothing. Bah! She looked closer at the label. It was perfect, with fancy gold letters and a seal from a laboratory, but as her thumb brushed against the corner of the sticker, the paper peeled away too easily. Underneath the gold label was a plain, cheap white one. Deborah's heart began to drum against her ribs. She tipped the bottle upside down. A tiny bit of white powder was stuck in the bottom corner. Deborah looked around the empty hallway to make sure no one was watching. She touched her finger to the powder and put it on her tongue. It didn't taste like medicine. It was sweet. It was plain, simple sugar. A cold shiver ran down Deborah's spine. The expensive heart medicine was a fake. The nurse wasn't giving Yolanda life-saving drugs. She was giving her sugar pills. This was why Yolanda was shaking. This was why her heart was failing. The treatments were a lie, a plan to make William think his mother was being cared for while she was actually being left to die. Deborah leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to breathe. She realized that the medical staff weren't just lazy, they were dangerous. They were stealing the money William gave them and letting an old woman suffer. But who could she tell? If she went to William, the nurse would just call her a liar. William already suspected her because she was new and poor. If she spoke up without proof, he might throw her out. Or worse. She looked back at the empty bottle in her hand. The silence of the big house felt heavy now, like it was full of secrets. She knew she couldn't stay quiet, but she also knew she had to be smart. Yolanda was running out of time, and Deborah was the only one who knew the truth. As she tucked the empty bottle into her pocket, she heard William's heavy footsteps in the hallway above. The boss was nearby, and his rage was always just below the surface. Deborah realized that to save Yolanda, she would have to become the very thing William feared, a thief who worked in the dark. The night air was cold and damp as Deborah stood by the window of her small staff room. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the fake gold label on the sugar pill bottle. She saw Yolanda's pale face and heard her weak, shaky breathing. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen. Deborah knew she was sitting on a dangerous secret, and the weight of it made her feel like she was underwater. A soft sound came from the hallway outside. It was the clicking of sensible shoes on the hardwood floor. Deborah froze. She knew that sound. It was the head nurse. Usually, the nurse stayed in the medical wing at this hour, but tonight she was moving toward the back exit. Deborah felt a spark of curiosity mixed with fear. She grabbed her thin sweater and slipped out of her room, staying close to the shadows of the wall. She followed the nurse down the service stairs and through the heavy kitchen doors. The nurse moved quickly, looking over her shoulder every few seconds. She was carrying a small, heavy-looking cardboard box tucked under her arm. Deborah's heart hammered against her ribs. She stayed far back, using the large bushes in the garden to hide herself as they moved toward the far edge of the estate, near the iron gates. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the garden look like a forest of ghosts. The only light came from the small guard shack near the entrance. Deborah watched as the nurse stepped into the pool of light. A dark black car was waiting on the other side of the gate. A man in a leather jacket stepped out, his face hidden by a baseball cap. The nurse didn't say a word. She reached through the iron bars and handed the cardboard box to the man. He opened it quickly. Inside were dozens of small blue and gold boxes. Deborah gasped quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. She recognized those boxes. They were the real heart medication, the expensive stuff William Carroll had ordered for his mother. The nurse wasn't just giving Yolanda fake pills, she was stealing the real ones to sell them. The man handed the nurse a thick white envelope. The nurse tucked it into her pocket and gave a small, wicked nod. Then the car sped away into the night, leaving the nurse standing alone in the dark. "So that's where it's going," Deborah whispered to herself. The shadow nurse was running a business right under William's nose. She was selling Yolanda's life for an envelope full of cash. Deborah felt a wave of cold anger. These people were supposed to be healers, but they were acting like monsters. She watched as the nurse turned around and started heading back toward the main house. Deborah scrambled backward into the darkness, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. She had to get back to her room before she was caught. As she ran, she accidentally kicked a small stone. The sound was loud in the quiet night. The nurse stopped and looked toward the bushes. "Who's there?" she called out. Her voice was sharp and dangerous. Deborah pressed her back against a large oak tree, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed that the nurse couldn't see her in the dark. She thought about William Carroll and his fierce, angry face. If the nurse caught her out here, she could easily tell William that Deborah was the one trying to sell things at the gate. The nurse had power. And Deborah was just a girl with $43 in her pocket. The silence lasted for a long time. Finally, the nurse let out a huff and kept walking. Deborah waited until the back door clicked shut before she finally dared to move. She made her way back to her room, her hands shaking so hard she could barely turn the doorknob. She sat on her narrow bed and stared at the wall. The situation was much worse than she thought. It wasn't just one fake bottle. It was a whole plan to drain William's money and let Yolanda fade away. Deborah knew that if she went to William now, she had no way to prove what she saw. The nurse would just lie, and William would believe his trusted medical staff over a maid he barely knew. She looked at her small bag of belongings in the corner. Part of her wanted to run away, to leave this house of secrets and go back to her car where she was safe. But then she thought of Yolanda's tired eyes and the way she held Deborah's hand. She thought of the shadow nurse and the white envelope of stolen money. "I can't leave her," Deborah said to the empty room. "If I go, no one will be left to help her." She realized that to save Yolanda, she would have to do more than just clean rooms. She would have to find a way to get that real medicine back. She would have to become a shadow herself, moving through the house at night to find where the nurse hid the supplies that hadn't been sold yet. The stakes were higher than ever. If she failed, Yolanda would die, and William would probably make sure Deborah never walked out of those iron gates again. As the first light of morning began to touch the sky, Deborah didn't feel tired. She felt a cold, sharp focus. She had a plan, and she knew exactly what she had to do next. The moon was high in the sky, but for Deborah, the night felt darker than usual. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at her hands. They were shaking so much, she had to sit on them to make them stop. In her mind, she kept seeing the nurse handing over that box of real medicine for an envelope of cash. She knew that every hour she waited was another hour that Yolanda's heart grew weaker. She had a choice to make, and it was a terrifying one. She could stay in her room, keep her head down, and do the job she was hired to do. If she did that, she would be safe. She would keep her $43 and have a roof over her head. But if she stayed silent, Yolanda would surely die. The other choice was to go into the medical station and take back the medicine that the nurse was hiding. "If William catches me, he won't listen to me," Deborah whispered to the shadows. She knew how he looked at her, with suspicion and coldness. To a man like William Carroll, a maid caught with expensive drugs was a criminal, plain and simple. He wouldn't care about her excuses. He would see a girl stealing from his dying mother, and his rage would be legendary. Still, Deborah thought of her own mother. She remembered the long nights spent by her bedside, wishing she had the money to buy the things that could have saved her. Now, the medicine was right here, just a few hallways away, locked behind a glass door. She couldn't let another mother fade away just because of greed and lies. Deborah stood up. She didn't put on her shoes. She knew the marble floors would echo every step, so she stayed in her thick wool socks. She slipped out of her room and stepped into the hallway. The Carroll estate at night was a scary place. The large paintings on the walls seemed to watch her, and the silence was so heavy it made her ears ring. She moved like a ghost, pressing her back against the cold stone walls. Every time the house creaked, she froze, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached the west wing and saw the door to the medical station. It was a small room next to Yolanda's, filled with cabinets and monitors. The nurse usually kept the door locked when she wasn't inside. Deborah reached the door and turned the knob. It didn't budge. She felt a wave of panic. She almost turned back, but then she remembered seeing the nurse hide a key inside a hollowed-out book on a nearby shelf. Her fingers searched the shelf, feeling the spines of the books until she found the one that felt too light. She pulled it open, and there it was, a small silver key. Her hands were sweating as she put the key into the lock. Click. The sound felt as loud as a drum in the quiet hallway. She pushed the door open and slipped inside. The room smelled strongly of alcohol and bleach. In the corner, a small glass cabinet held rows of bottles. She saw the blue and gold boxes immediately. These were the real ones, the life-saving pills the nurse hadn't sold yet. Deborah reached out and grabbed one box. Just as she tucked it into her pocket, she heard a heavy footstep in the hallway outside. Her breath hitched. It wasn't the light click of the nurse's shoes. It was the slow, heavy stride of a man. It was William. Deborah scrambled under a small desk, pulling her knees to her chest. She watched the gap at the bottom of the door. A shadow blocked the light for a second. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying he wouldn't come in. She could almost feel his anger through the wood. If he opened that door and saw the new girl hiding under a desk with a box of stolen medicine, it would be the end for her. The shadow stayed there for a long time. Deborah's legs began to cramp, and she struggled not to make a sound. Finally, the footsteps started again, moving slowly down the hall toward Yolanda's room. Deborah waited until she couldn't hear him anymore. She crawled out from under the desk, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She locked the station door and put the key back in the book, her fingers still trembling. She had done it. She had the medicine. But as she walked back to her room, she realized that the danger had only just started. She couldn't just give the pills to Yolanda in front of everyone. She would have to hide them. She would have to sneak them into the room and give them to the old woman when no one was looking. She was no longer just a maid. In the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of William Carroll, she was now a thief. She looked at the blue and gold box in her hand. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. She knew that from this moment on, every step she took in this house was a dangerous choice. She was playing a game with a Mafia boss, and the price of losing was her life. But as she thought of Yolanda's weak smile, Deborah knew she would do it all over again. Deborah woke up before the sun. The blue and gold box of real medicine was hidden inside an old shoe at the back of her closet. Her heart felt heavy every time she looked at it, but she knew it was the only thing that could save Yolanda. She pulled on her black Maid uniform and smoothed the white collar. In this house, the color black was usually a sign of danger, but for the woman in the West Wing, Deborah was becoming an angel in black. She entered Yolanda's room just as the cold morning light hit the floor. The head nurse had already been there, leaving a tray with a glass of water and a single sugar pill. Deborah waited until she heard the nurse's footsteps disappear down the hall. Then she quickly swapped the fake pill for a real one from her pocket. "Here, ma'am," Deborah whispered, helping Yolanda sit up. "Take this. It's the good stuff." Yolanda swallowed the pill and looked at Deborah with wide, curious eyes. "You seem different today, Deborah. You have a secret in your eyes." Deborah just smiled and started to brush Yolanda's silver hair. She was very gentle, untangling the knots that the nurse had ignored for days. I just want you to feel strong again, Mrs. Carroll." But Deborah knew the medicine wasn't enough. Yolanda was starving for vitamins and real nutrition. Later that afternoon, during her 1 hour of free time, Deborah walked to a small pharmacy a few blocks away from the estate gates. She pulled out her worn wallet and counted her money. She had exactly $43 left in the world. She looked at the shelves filled with expensive vitamins and high-energy supplements. A bottle of the best liquid vitamins cost $25. That was more than half of everything she owned. If she bought it, she wouldn't have enough to pay her phone bill or save for a bus ticket if she got fired. She stood there for a long time, looking at the money in her hand. Then she thought of Yolanda's shaky hands and her pale face. Deborah walked to the counter and paid for the vitamins. She also bought a small jar of organic honey and some soft herbal tea. As she walked back to the estate, she felt lighter, even though her wallet was nearly empty. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a protector. Back in the West Wing, Deborah had to be very careful. She hid the vitamins inside an empty cleaning spray bottle that she had washed out thoroughly. Every time she brought Yolanda a glass of water, she would sneak a few drops of the vitamins into it. She watched as Yolanda's skin slowly lost its gray color. A tiny bit of pink began to show in the old woman's cheeks. "You are so good to me," Yolanda whispered one evening. Deborah was sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing a gentle lotion into Yolanda's dry, papery skin. "My son is a powerful man, but he doesn't know how to be gentle. He thinks money fixes everything." "He loves you," Deborah said, though she wasn't entirely sure. She had seen the way William's face twisted when he looked at his mother, but he never stayed long enough to actually talk to her. "He is afraid," Yolanda said, her voice a bit stronger than before. "He is afraid of losing me, So he hides behind his desk and his monitors. He trusts the wrong people because they have fancy titles. Just then, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Deborah jumped up and grabbed her cleaning cloth, pretending to scrub the dresser. William walked into the room. He didn't say hello. He just stood at the foot of the bed, his dark eyes moving from his mother to Deborah. He looked suspicious, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. "She looks different today," William said. His voice was deep and rumbled like thunder. Deborah kept her head down, her heart racing. "I've just been making sure she stays hydrated, Mr. Carroll." William stepped closer to Deborah. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head back to see him. He looked at her simple black dress and the neat ponytail. "I don't like people who move too quietly, Deborah. It makes me wonder what they are hiding." He stayed for a moment longer, the smell of expensive cologne and tobacco following him. Then, without a word to his mother, he turned and left. Deborah let out a long breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Yolanda, who had closed her eyes to rest. Deborah realized that her angel in black act was working, but the shadows were closing in. She was spending her last bits of money and risking her life every day. She knew that the nurse was starting to notice that Yolanda wasn't fading away as fast as she should. The trap was being built, and Deborah was right in the middle of it. But as she tucked the blanket around Yolanda's shoulders, she knew she wouldn't stop. She would be the light in this dark house for as long as she could. The air in the Carroll estate felt like the moment before a big thunderstorm. It was quiet, but it was a scary kind of quiet. Deborah kept her head down as she walked through the halls, letting her heart heavy with the secret of the blue and gold medicine box. She thought she was being careful, but she didn't know that the head nurse was finally starting to count the bottles. In the small medical station, the nurse stood in front of the glass cabinet. Her face was red with anger. She had a list in her hand, and the numbers didn't add up. She had promised to sell 3 more boxes to the man at the gate, but when she reached into the back of the shelf, one was missing. She knew she hadn't sold it yet. Her eyes narrowed as she looked toward Yolanda's room. She also noticed that Yolanda wasn't coughing as much. The patient she was trying to weaken was suddenly sitting up and smiling. The nurse realized someone was undoing her work. She knew it had to be the maid, since no one else spent that much time in the West Wing. She remembered Deborah's questions about the medicine and the way the girl always looked at the trash. A mean, thin smile spread across the nurse's face. She didn't have to prove the maid was helping. She just had to make William believe the maid was hurting his mother. Later that afternoon, Deborah was in Yolanda's room, gently wiping the dust from a picture frame. She felt a cold shiver go down her back. She turned around and saw the nurse standing in the doorway. The nurse wasn't yelling. She was just watching Deborah with those ice-cold blue eyes. "You think you're very smart, don't you?" the nurse whispered. "But in this house, people like you don't last long." Deborah gripped her cleaning cloth tightly. "I don't know what you mean, nurse. I'm just doing my job." "We'll see about that," the nurse said, then turned and walked away toward the main part of the house. The nurse headed straight for William Carroll's office. She didn't knock. She walked right in, looking like she was about to cry. William was sitting behind his massive desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His neck tattoos seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. He looked up, his jaw tight and his eyebrows furrowed. "What is it now?" William growled. "I'm busy." The nurse wiped at her eyes, pretending to be upset. "Mr. Carroll, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I had to come to you. Something terrible is happening in the West Wing. I've been noticed that your mother's expensive heart medicine is disappearing from the locked cabinet." William stood up slowly. His shadow stretched across the room, looking like a giant. "Disappearing? How?" "It's the new maid, Deborah," the nurse lied, her voice shaking on purpose. "I saw her sneaking out of the medical room last night. I didn't want to believe it, but I checked her references again. I think she has a dark past. I think she is a drug addict, Mr. Carroll. She's stealing the heart medicine to sell it or to use it herself. That's why your mother isn't getting better. Deborah is taking the very thing that is supposed to save her." William's face turned into a mask of pure rage. He slammed his hand down on the desk, making the whiskey glass jump. The idea of someone stealing from his mother, especially someone he had brought into his home, made his blood boil. He thought about Deborah's quiet ways and her soft voice. He had felt something was hidden behind her innocent look, and now he thought he knew what it was. "A drug addict?" William whispered. The words sounded like a death sentence. "In my mother's room?" "I'm afraid so," the nurse said, hidden behind a fake look of worry. "She's dangerous. She's stealing your mother's life just to get some quick cash or a high. You have to do something before it's too late." William didn't call for his security team yet. He was a man who liked to see things with his own eyes. He wanted to catch her in the act so he could show her exactly what happens to people who betray the Carroll family. "Leave me," William ordered. Once the nurse was gone, William sat back in his large leather chair. He stared at the empty wall, his mind filling with dark thoughts. He felt like a fool for trusting a girl with a low ponytail and warm brown eyes. He decided right then that he wouldn't just throw her out, he would trap her. He picked up his phone and called his lead technician. "I want a hidden camera in my mother's room," he commanded. "Right now. Hide it in the clock or the bookshelf. I want to see every move that Maid makes. I want to see her reach for that bottle." The trap was set. The shadow nurse had successfully poisoned the lion's mind. Deborah was still in the West Wing, tucked away with Yolanda, completely unaware that the man she feared was now watching her every move. She thought she was saving a life, but to the man behind the monitors, she was about to become the victim of a very dangerous mistake. The hidden eye was now open, and it was waiting for Deborah to make one wrong move. William Carroll sat in his dark office, the only sound being the soft hum of the computers. A single glass of whiskey sat on his desk, the amber liquid glowing in the light from the screens. He had just finished watching his lead technician leave through the back door. The job was done. A tiny, high-tech camera was now hidden inside the old wooden clock on his mother's mantel. It was so small that even a hawk wouldn't notice it, but it would show William every single thing that happened in that room. William leaned back in his large leather chair, his jaw so tight it started to ache. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the nurse's voice calling Deborah a drug addict. He felt a hot, stinging shame in his gut. He prided himself on being a man who could see through anyone, yet he had let a young woman with a simple ponytail and a kind smile walk right into his home and steal from his dying mother. To William, this wasn't just a crime, it was a personal insult. "You think you can play me?" he whispered to the empty room. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, feeling the burn in his throat. His neck tattoos seemed to twitch as he gritted his teeth. He wasn't just angry. He was fueled by a dark kind of rage that wanted to break things. He wanted to catch Deborah in the act so he could see the fear in her eyes when she realized who she had crossed. On the main monitor, the screen flickered to life. The hidden eye was open. The picture was clear and bright. He could see his mother, Yolanda, lying in bed. She looked so small and pale under the covers. Then the door opened, and Deborah walked in. William leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He watched her every move like a cat watching a mouse. Deborah didn't look like a criminal. She moved gracefully, checking the water pitcher and smoothing the blankets. But William didn't care about how she looked anymore. He was waiting for the moment her hand reached for the medicine. He was waiting for the theft that would justify his vengeance. Hours passed. The ice in William's glass melted, but he didn't move. He stayed in that chair, staring at the screen until his eyes felt scratchy and dry. He watched Deborah sit by his mother's side. He saw her lips moving as she talked to Yolanda, though he couldn't hear the words. It looked so peaceful, so caring. "It's an act," William muttered, slamming his glass down on the desk. It has to be an act. He was trapped in his own head. Half of him wanted her to be innocent because he liked the way his mother smiled when Deborah was around. But the other half, the part of him that had survived in a world of criminals and liars, knew that people were rarely what they seemed. He had seen the best men turn into traitors for a few dollars. Why would this girl be any different? Suddenly, Deborah stood up. She looked toward the door, then back at Yolanda. She seemed nervous. She walked over to the dresser where the medicine was kept. William's heart started to drum against his ribs. This was it. He watched as Deborah reached into the pocket of her black Maid uniform. She pulled out a small blue and gold box. William froze. That was the real heart medicine. He saw her look at the door again, her face tight with worry. Then she reached for the bottle the nurse had left on the tray. The bottle William now knew contained the fake pills. "Come on," William hissed at the screen. "Show me who you really are." He watched as she swapped the bottles. His mind was racing. Why was she putting a new box there? Was she taking the old one to sell? Or was she switching them? He couldn't tell yet. His rage was so high that he could only see the movement as a crime. He didn't see the care in her hands. He didn't see the way she breathed a sigh of relief when the swap was done. To William, she was just a thief caught on camera. He felt a surge of cold triumph. He had his proof. He reached for the button on his desk to call his guards, his finger hovering just inches away. He was ready to end the game right now. He was ready to show Deborah Agee what happened when you tried to steal from a Carol. But something made him stop. On the screen, Deborah didn't run away with the stolen goods. Instead, she sat back down on the edge of the bed. She took Yolanda's hand and held it against her cheek. She looked like she was praying. William's hand stayed frozen over the button. The whiskey and the rage were still there, but a tiny spark of confusion started to grow. He decided to wait just a few more minutes. He would watch a little longer. He didn't know that the hidden eye was about to show him a story he never expected to see, a story that would change everything he believed about his house, his staff, and himself. He sat back in the shadows, his eyes locked on the monitor, waiting for the truth to finally come into the light. William's finger stayed frozen just an inch above the button that would bring his guards into the room. But his eyes were glued to the screen, watching the wreck light flicker in the corner of the monitor. He was waiting for the final proof that Deborah was a thief. But then, the bedroom door on the screen swung open, and the head nurse walked in. William watched as the nurse's face changed. The worried look she wore in his office was gone. Instead, her face was hard and mean. She didn't walk to the bed with kindness. She marched over and pulled the silk blankets off Yolanda so roughly that the old woman gasped in surprise. On the silent screen, William saw his mother's mouth open in a small cry of pain. But the nurse didn't care. The nurse picked up the blue and gold medicine box, the real heart medicine William had paid a fortune for. She didn't give a pill to Yolanda. Instead, she tucked the box into her own medical bag. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a plain, cheap bottle. She shook out a white pill and shoved it toward Yolanda's lips. William felt a cold shock go through his body. He watched as his mother shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. He could almost hear her begging, but the nurse just laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was a cruel, mocking one. She leaned down close to Yolanda's ear, her face twisted with hate. Even without sound, William could see the nurse was saying something terrible. She pushed the fake pill into Yolanda's mouth and forced her to drink the water so fast that the old woman started to cough and choke. "No," William whispered, his voice cracking. He felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He had trusted this woman. He had paid her to be his mother's protector, but she was acting like a monster. He realized that the drug addict story was a lie to cover up her own crimes. The nurse checked her watch, looked at Yolanda one last time with total disgust, and walked out of the room. Yolanda was left alone, shaking and crying into her silk pillows. William felt a hot, burning shame. He had been so blind. He had been watching the wrong person the whole time. Then, the door opened again. Deborah walked in. William held his breath. He watched as Deborah rushed to the bedside. She didn't look like a thief. She looked like a daughter. She immediately grabbed a warm cloth and wiped the water and tears from Yolanda's face. She held Yolanda's shaking hands until they became still. Then Deborah did something that made William's heart stop. She reached under the dresser into a hidden spot William hadn't noticed before. She pulled out the blue and gold box, the one she had stolen back from the nurse's desk. She carefully gave Yolanda the real medicine. She didn't just shove it at her. She waited, blew on a spoonful of water to make it the right temperature, and whispered to her until Yolanda finally looked peaceful. William watched as Deborah took out the small bottle of vitamins she had bought with her last $43. She added the drops to Yolanda's water. She brushed his mother's silver hair with so much love that William had to look away from the screen for a moment. He saw the angel in black in action. He saw the girl he had called a criminal risking her life to undo the damage the nurse was doing. The whiskey glass in William's hand shattered as he gripped it too hard. He didn't even notice the small cut on his palm. His disbelief had turned into a cold, terrifying fury. It was a rage so deep that it felt like ice in his veins. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a son who had almost let his mother be murdered by his own pride. He looked at the nurse's empty station on another monitor, then back at Deborah, who was currently tucking the blanket around Yolanda's shoulders. Deborah was a hero, and he had treated her like trash. The nurse was a traitor, and he had treated her like family. William stood up slowly. His chair fell backward, hitting the floor with a loud thud. He didn't look at the whiskey on his desk or the tattoos on his neck. He only looked at the door. The time for watching was over. The hidden eye had shown him everything he needed to see. He didn't call his guards through the phone. He walked out of his office, his heavy boots echoing like drumbeats in the quiet hallway. Every step he took felt like a promise of vengeance. He was headed for the West Wing, and this time, he wasn't going as a hunter. He was going as a man who finally knew who his real enemies were. The storm was coming to the Carroll estate, and William Carroll was the one bringing the thunder. The doors to the West Wing burst open with a sound like a gunshot. William Carroll marched down the hallway, his heavy boots thumping against the floor. Behind him, 4 of his largest security guards followed in total silence. William's face was a mask of cold, hard stone. His neck tattoos seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. He didn't stop until he reached the medical station. The head nurse was sitting at the desk, counting the money in her white envelope. When she saw William, she jumped up, her face turning as white as her uniform. She tried to hide the envelope behind her back, a fake smile spreading across her lips. "Mr. Carroll, I didn't expect you—" "Be quiet," William said. His voice was so low and sharp it felt like a knife. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He reached out and snatched the envelope from her hand. He tossed it onto the desk, and dozens of $100 bills spilled out. "I saw the camera," William said, stepping closer until he was looming over her. "I saw you steal the medicine. I saw you mock my mother. I saw you give her sugar while she was dying." The nurse's eyes went wide with terror. She started to babble, trying to find a lie that would save her. "No, sir, you don't understand. The maid—" "The maid is the only reason my mother is still breathing," William growled. He turned to his guards and pointed a finger at the nurse. "Get her out of my sight. Take her to the police and make sure they know exactly what she did. If I ever see her face again, she will regret it." The guards grabbed the nurse by the arms and dragged her out. She screamed and kicked, her sensible shoes scraping against the floor, until the sound of her voice finally faded away. William stood in the empty station for a moment, his chest heaving. He felt a deep, stinging shame. He had been so busy being a boss that he had forgotten how to be a son. He turned and walked into Yolanda's room. Deborah was standing by the window, her hands pressed against her chest. She looked terrified. She had heard the shouting and the struggle, and she was sure that William was coming for her next. She saw him standing in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on her. She looked at his clenched fists and the anger in his posture, and she felt her knees start to give way. "Mr. Carroll," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was only trying to help her." "Please, I didn't mean to steal, I just—" William didn't say a word. He walked across the room until he was standing right in front of her. Deborah closed her eyes, waiting for him to yell or tell her to leave. Instead, she heard a soft rustle of fabric. When she opened her eyes, she gasped. William Carroll, the man the whole city feared, was down on one knee. He stayed there, his head bowed, his large hands resting on his thighs. The powerful Mafia boss looked small in the middle of the room. He was humbling himself before a girl who had nothing but a kind heart. "I am so sorry," William said. His voice wasn't a growl anymore. It was broken and thick with emotion. "I watched the footage. I saw what you did for her. I saw how you spent your own money to buy her vitamins. I saw how you protected her while I was busy being blind." Deborah stared at him, her mouth hanging open. She didn't know what to do. "Please, Mr. Carroll, stand up. You don't have to do this." "I do," William said, looking up at her. Tears were shining in his dark eyes. "I thought you were a thief, but you were the only person in this house with any honor. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who claim to be loyal, but they only love my money. You are the only one who truly cared about my mother." He reached out and gently took Deborah's hand. His grip was strong but careful, as if he were afraid he might break her. "You saved her life, Deborah. I owe you a debt I can never fully pay." Yolanda watched them from the bed, a soft smile on her face. She looked stronger already, her eyes bright and clear. "He's right, dear," Yolanda whispered. "You are the angel this house needed." William stood up slowly and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at Deborah, really seeing her for the first time, not as a maid, but as a hero. "From now on, you aren't the maid. You are the head of this house's care. You will have whatever you need, doctors you trust, the best food, anything, and your salary, I'm tripling it. You will never have to worry about a bus ticket or a phone bill again." Deborah felt a tear slide down her cheek. "I just wanted her to be okay." "I know," William said. And for the first time, he gave her a small, real smile. "And that is why I trust you." The sun began to set over the Carroll estate, casting long, golden shadows across the room. The hidden eye was still in the clock, but there were no more secrets to catch. William sat down in a chair beside the bed and took his mother's hand, finally acting like the son she deserved. Deborah stood by the window, watching them, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She had arrived at the estate as an outsider in a house of criminals, but she had ended up finding a family. In a world of marble and gold, she had proven that the simplest things, a spoon of medicine, a gentle brush of the hair, and a kind heart, were the most powerful things of all. The debt of a boss had been paid, and for the first time in a long time, the Carroll estate felt like a home.